Okay, I think we're good to go. I've prattled along for 2 minutes to just make sure everybody who was on time is in. So Zanele, let me now officially say hi to you. How are you doing, Zanele, down locked down in Durban with family? I think I heard a music lesson or something going on in the background a moment ago. Lockdown is fun, isn't it?
It's lovely. So my brother is just on a call with his tutor. So fortunately, he's one of those people that can have a virtual lesson studying music, which is quite a privilege for him. But that's what's going on. So if you do hear a cello in the background, that's what's cooking here.
Oh, beautiful, a cello. Okay. Very, very nice. I played the trumpet for most of my life, and I'm always grateful I didn't choose the harp or the cello or anything, carrying it around in the back of the car. If you hear anything on my side, it's because we have emergency plumbers in the system. We've had issues with drainage and all the rest, and we had to go and get those unblocked. Life carries on, I suppose, and Zanele, that's really the theme of our conversation. You and I have been chatting over the last few days. If you don't know us, Zanele and Njapha, Graeme, Codrington, we are from a company called TomorrowToday, and we are futurists. That doesn't mean we can predict the future, but it does mean that we track trends. We try and understand the disruptive forces that are shaping the world around us. And of course, in 2020, in fact, Zanele, we've been saying for a number of years that the 2020s are going to be the most disruptive decade of all time. So far, I think we get about 100%. We get about 100%, right? We never expected it to be this disrupted this quickly, but disruption is our game. We track it, we try and understand it, and we try and help people prepare for it. So, Zanele, in terms of where we are at the moment, right? A lot of people, we're both based in South Africa, but we have international clients. A lot of our clients are thinking about, a lot of the people that we know are thinking about, when does lockdown, or Singapore calls it the circuit breaker, America calls it shelter in place, when does that come to an end? Few countries have extended it. When does it come to an end? Now, I know you and I have been chatting. This is the wrong question, right? Because yes, of course, lockdown will come to an end. But after lockdown, I mean, do we just all go back to normal? Do we go back to work the next day?
Yeah, that's the thing, Graeme. So unfortunately, there is no normal to go back to. And this is the main reality that we have to face. So things are going to change, and they are already changing. And I think one of the main places I want us to start is, what does the end of lockdown actually look like? And I'd like you to go a little bit more into this, but I want to just start with a quick story. Just to rewind a little bit to set our context quite nicely here. During the times of smallpox, my paternal grandmother had, there were 14 of them, and 9 of her siblings lost their lives at a young age to smallpox. All because a visitor that was actually passing by their neighborhood needed shelter and needed a place to just sleep for the night, and food, a plate of food to have. And because this was the communal culture in the community, this person was brought into the household, and this ended up happening. So the point I want to make as we go ahead now is that what's happened to us is going to change the very culture and the way we interact with each other. So there's no nook and cranny that is safe from COVID-19. And I think that's such an important point to make. It's not just our businesses, it's everything. But most importantly, it is actually the way we do business.
Yeah, sure. What an important story. I was just looking yesterday at a story about the 1918 and 1919 Spanish flu. Virus, and in 1918 it killed a few million people around the world, and it was a chaotic thing right after the end of World War I. And then in the northern hemisphere, at least, summer came and the flu subsided, and everybody thought, wow, that was horrible, but at least it's over. And then in the winter of 1919, even more people died the second time around. And I think this is part of the concern that epidemiologists have is, yes, we understand that lockdown has been dramatic and has had a huge impact on the economy. But, and here's the point, lockdown won't be extended indefinitely. We can't. The economy will crash and burn. But we have to also realize that we can't simply release lockdown. Until we have a vaccine, we are not going to be safe from this virus. This virus will live in the system. And of course, for some people, that's not a major issue because you get the disease and it doesn't have a huge impact on your system. But I mean, your story, Zanele, reminds us nine children die because you allow somebody with smallpox into your house. So how many of us are going to be prepared to take the chance of letting somebody with COVID-19 or somebody who's infectious with COVID-19 into our houses, even after lockdown is finished? And so we can't think in terms of lockdown being cancelled, right? We've got to realize that even when we ease out of lockdown, we are going to have to act as if we have never had COVID and everybody else does have it. So it's this kind of mindset where we've got to imagine, to protect myself, I've got to pretend I've never had it and everybody else has got it. Then to protect everybody else, I've got to pretend they've never had it and I've already got it. In other words, we have to continue to let me be careful. We must socially connect and physically distance ourselves from each other. So we need to physically distance 2 meters from each other. And we're going to have to make sure that we probably wear masks in public, don't shake hands, don't hug, wash our hands regularly, sanitize our workplaces regularly. So there's a lot for us to think about.
I think as a part of that conversation as well, sorry, Graeme, is now with the workplace and with interacting, because once our lockdowns are partially or completely actually raised, it doesn't necessarily mean that, scram, everyone gets to go into society and interact the way that they used to. It literally does mean we will have to still physically distance. Does it not?
Absolutely. So, Zanele, we were talking about some examples. Let's help people understand this. So you and I, we fly regularly for our work, all over the country, all over the world. Now, if you have to continue to physical distance from each other, how do you get on an airplane? I don't know about you, Zanele. I'm going to be very nervous to get on an airplane if I'm going to have to sit in seats like you could see on the screen. You know, even if the guys come through and sort of sanitize the plane from the last set of passengers, I'm not going to, how do I know that the passenger sitting next to me isn't breathing COVID over me for 1, 2, or 10 hours? I don't know about you. Are you going to be comfortable flying?
Not at all. Not at all. And I think that this is actually going to go on until the end of 2020. For now, if you have any international travel plans, I would say let's rather relook those. And
certainly anything other than essential plane travel, I think is going to have a huge question mark over it. And so, Zanele, one of the options somebody was chatting to me about was you can socially distance on an airplane. So in this picture that we can see here, you can have one person in row 14A, then another person in row 15F, then another person in row 16D. So you're sort of one person per row. The question I have is, can airlines afford to fly their planes that empty?
Especially with your smaller carriers, right? That are already in trouble with all of the economies now being shaken up. And I think it would be the same with buses and trains. And think about your minibus taxis here in South Africa.
Yeah. And so obviously people are essentially taking your life in your hands, getting onto a train, getting onto a taxi. So even if we say to South Africa in the next 2 weeks, okay, go back to work, there might be people who say, well, yes, sure, boss, I'll come back to work, but I'm not prepared to come in during the rush hour because I don't want to be seated with 10 other people in a taxi, or 1,000 other people in a train. So we might need to stagger and go to shift work maybe? I mean, what are some of the ideas that you've already started to see people doing? I've had people think about going to shifts, for example. Obviously there's some companies already work shifts, but some companies that don't work shifts, even if it's not shifts, they stagger the starting time and the ending time of people coming in. Have you seen any other clever ideas yet?
So that could be one of them. And another could be certain individuals within the company, whether it's a certain functions, are allowed to actually work from home, where you work from and how you work becomes an option, unlike it's ever been before. So it's more objective based. And whether you're working from home or you're coming into the office, it's a decision that you make as someone that's within the workforce. Whether you want to put yourself at risk or not is something that you choose. So I think that works quite nicely. Looking forward to seeing how that fares out, I think.
So in fact, we can ask a question here already. So we can now, guys, we haven't been looking at the chat yet. So Zanele, you and I can quickly do a scan through the chat in case some people have made some contributions.
Absolutely. We were just talking, I know, Graeme, you're a big rock concert guy.
1980s bands. Anytime you're in my city, I'll come and watch you and open my wallet for you. Perfect.
No football matches, and those are the types of environments that we've previously enjoyed, but we find ourselves crammed as sardines that we may need to rethink going forward.
Yeah. And you know what, Ignatius and Peter, you've both mentioned virtual reality here. I'm really excited to see, because I know that there are a lot of firms putting stuff into virtual reality. And at the moment, it's sort of just gaming and interesting things. But I honestly think that a lot of the disruptions that we knew were coming. I mean, Zanele, you and I have been talking about virtual reality in the classroom and virtual reality in the workplace for a while. Those disruptions were on their way. This COVID-19 crisis is not going to delay some of those disruptions. It's actually going to accelerate them. And so we're going to see massive shifts in the way we do a lot of these activities simply because we have to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Graeme. And I think one of the things I identified that was done by Global Shapers Hub, so they work with the World Economic Forum in Rome, was that even though we want to look at the future of businesses and how the client profile is going to change, we also want to look at how businesses can survive now. And what they've done is actually something that's quite exciting, is that they've looked at how restaurants are actually losing money at the moment. And they've given an option to consumers to actually buy coupons for future meals. And this was something I thought was quite exciting, so that the restaurant at the moment, with all of the strain on the economy, is able to make some kind of income that they'll obviously be able to then work out later on. But during this particular time, they're able to move through this kind of financial strain that's going on.
What a really interesting idea. So if you've got a local restaurant that you used to go to quite regularly a few times a month, you can continue to support them, make sure that they're still around when you come back, even if you can't buy their food right now. I really like that idea. I'm not sure I know the name or contact details of the owners of the restaurants near me, but I think I must look them up, and hopefully they're checking their emails. While Zanele and I talk, please go to the chat box and tell us if your company has already started to have these conversations with you or not. Zanele and I are seeing that companies are not yet having these conversations. They've been in crisis mode about how do we survive the fact that we don't have customers or we don't, we can't deliver our services. But I don't think they've yet gathered their staff together and said, what does May, June, July, August, October, November into next year? A Garland asked a question saying, are we going to be allowed to have public gatherings? And the answer is no. I put up a picture there of a restaurant. You've just talked about restaurants, Zanele. You can't, restaurants are going to have to keep 2-meter distances between tables. Families who come in, people who come in who living in one house, so they lock down together, that's fine. They're prepared to be in each other's space so they can sit around one table. But then I want 2 meters distance between me and the next table, right? Yeah. And most restaurants pack people in a lot closer than that. and they're going to have to take half their tables out. I mean, what does a restaurant do then? Have you had any clever ideas, or have you got some creative ideas? And Zanele, I know we're going to get to some ideas for creativity at the end of this webinar, but just off the top of your head, if there is somebody who is in the restaurant business here, I like the idea of the coupons, but if they do open their restaurant, any clever ideas for them? We're seeing if there's anybody in the chat who's got any clever ideas as well. One of the things I think, Zanele, that restaurants will have to do, and maybe this reiterates the point that we've got, is that they can't just think of going back and opening their restaurant again. Mm-hmm. They might have to, for example, limit their menu. They might have to take only online bookings. So they didn't used to be a restaurant that you made bookings for. Now they have to, because they have to make sure they only have a certain number of people. Fred, you're suggesting cubicles, so you've actually literally put dividers in. That might be quite an expensive solution that some restaurants can't afford, but it certainly is something to consider. Any other ideas from your side, Zanele?
I think it's one of the main things you've just mentioned there, Graeme, is that restaurants really need to start to consider, and it's not just restaurants, all businesses, as we go into now our chat of how to become creative and innovative during this time, is to consider that the profile of your client is changing. And when you work from that standpoint, it makes it so much better. And we started off about speaking about how social or physical distancing is a thing now, but it's not just a now thing. The story that I spoke about earlier is all about how the culture of how we do things is going to change. Yeah. And when we start from that standpoint and we understand that people no longer process their products and their services the same way, then that will then inform how we do business going forward. So from our menus, you mentioned menus a little earlier, from what we offer, from where we're based, to our platforms on the internet, all of those things will come from how our customer profiles have changed and what people are responding to and want at the time.
And so just one or two more examples, Zanele, before we get to some of the practical stuff we really wanted to talk to, just help people think this stuff through. So you say culture, right? And here I have to be very, very careful and respectful. I do have an adopted daughter who has African hair. And so I have been made more familiar with the crisis that is African hair than maybe most white men my age. But I still realize I know nothing of the pain that you and others have to go through on a fairly regular basis. And of course, a lot of people will say, well, the way I do my hair, that is so much part of my culture, not just the style, but the actual process that you go through. You know, Saturday afternoons of all the teenage girls sitting around in a circle, each doing their hair. And if you want to say to somebody, you can't do that anymore, you know, part of the answer that people will give is, but that's my culture. You can't tell me to not do my culture. There's going to be a lot of us needing to think through, is your culture worth your life, right? And I think this is the point you're trying to make here, right? Isn't cultures going to change? As we think, how do you now do hairdressing and nails and waxing if you have to keep a 2 meter distance? You know, I don't want anybody with like 2 meter shears away from me cutting my hair, right? So I don't know, maybe I should have let you give that example, Zanele. You probably feel that pain a lot more than I do.
No, I think it was all right that you made that example. But just to add to it, this question of culture, it goes even further beyond that. So culture, literally, the bottom line around culture is rituals. And when we start to think about the rituals that we have on an everyday basis, from the rituals we follow when we wake up in the morning to what we do during our day to how we engage with people at the office, those are all rituals that make up our culture. So our daily culture, who we are and how we do things. Those are the types of things that are going to need to change. And it varies, Graeme, and you gave a really great example about how we do our hair. And this is now coming back to my unlearning, that the way you've always done things needs to always be in question. Once it becomes, this is how I've always done things, then that's exactly when you need to start to question it and change it around and see how you can pivot, especially now when things start to change so dramatically. So there's, yeah.
So let's help people then, because really our main point, and I think we've driven it home, we could talk about church, we could talk about schools, we could talk about call centers, we could talk about Ubers, we could talk, I mean, literally, if you understand what Zanele and I are saying, people, every single aspect of our lives is going to change. And some of the rituals that we are hoping to get back to, when people say, I can't wait for lockdown to be finished so we can get back to normal, I think kind of the point we're trying to make is there's no normal to go back to. There's a new normal that's going to emerge in every part of our lives. And it might be as simple as you thinking about changing your hairstyle, to what you do if your child can't go back to school, to what you do about church and your religious faith and you can't go and pack into those buildings anymore and you can't go for prayers, to what your office actually looks like. And Zanele, this is now well into your expertise, and this is why I really wanted to have the conversation with you today, because this is what you've been doing for years, helping companies to do that unlearning thing, to bring creativity, and not just to say, how do we tweak what we've done to make it slightly better, but to completely unpack it. So can you give us 3 or 4 things that each of us could do to really get into this unlearning creativity space that we're going to have to be in for the next few months?
All right, no problem. So I'd like to invite you, as I go through these, to maybe jump in with any examples you may have. And I actually also want to invite everyone that's on this call with us to also jump in with any examples you may have. Maybe you've tried a facet or an example of one of these and you'd love to share it because it's something that would work for other people. Please go right ahead and I'll have a look at those when I get a chance. So the very first thing that I want to suggest, and this is not necessarily something that needs any kind of practicality, but it's more of a mindset shift. And I always say that before we start to get hands-on, we need to start to work with our minds. And the first thing is see the change or see the situation as malleable. Understand that it can change. And I think COVID-19 is actually such a perfect example that things can change. And if they can, they definitely will. It's just a matter of time. So understand that your routines and your rituals and the way you've always been doing things, especially at work, is subject to change. So it can change at any moment. And if it can, it will. Once you've got that out of the way, then we can start to take personal inventory, which is the second thing. I've just published an article this morning on LinkedIn, and I'm actually going to share the link here quickly. And this article was actually talking about how it's important for us to start to take personal inventory in any crisis. So in times of disruption, one of the first things we want to do to get a better perspective is to take inventory, firstly, of the things that the situation may be teaching us. So what are we learning? Is there anything here in this situation, whether it's insights, knowledge, skills, values, and even attitudes that are coming to the foreground that I may need to learn here, that are up for grabs, in a sense, for me to learn here? And then the next one would be, what do I need to relearn? A lot of the time, there are skills, attitudes, values, insights even, that I've sort of put on the back burner over time. What are these things that I'm now going to need to bring back into the foreground and brush up on that are going to help me deal with the situation at hand? And then the last one would be unlearning. What are the things, and this one I've put last because it's one of the harder ones to get into. And this is what I work with organizations to help them do. How do we now move from one normal to the next? What are the things that are holding me back from moving from one normal to the next? Because I have this perception that this is the way I've always done things. These are the rituals and routines or even mindsets that I've always practiced and have worked for me up until this point, that I may be actually finding a bit difficult moving from one to the other. So with that, you'll see in the article that I actually suggest you just use a plain piece of paper and then you take just personal inventory, even in bullet points, to list what each of these might be for you. And then I give further steps on that as well. And then the very last one Yes, Graeme, looks like you might want to jump in there.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, cool. And then the very last one is an interesting one. Once you've taken personal inventory to see what it is that you may be needing to learn, unlearn, and relearn, whether it's on a personal scale or even within your business or the company that you work with, I'd like you to now start to see how that relates to the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, and then the most likely scenario. Now, this needs a lot of honesty. Graeme, I know you work with scenario planning with organizations, and I do a little bit of that in my head as well. And it's usually not easy, but you find that if you work from a scenario platform, it makes things a lot easier, especially with managing risk that may come in the future. So here we look at, and this needs a bit of honesty, it needs a bit of research, looking into what the situation actually looks like. What's the most likely thing? And let's speak about it just quickly, Graeme. What would the best case scenario be with COVID-19?
Well, I think the best case is that we either develop herd immunity, so just to make sure everybody understands the language, that means that most people have got the disease, they recover from it or only have mild symptoms, and then can't get it again. And then basically, in that scenario, there will be casualties. There will be people who die. Peter's made some interesting comments in the chat about us kind of being reminded. This is part of what some people's fear and anxiety is, that we all do die. And some of us are going to die younger than we thought with this COVID. And you mustn't be blasé about that, but it's also is part of life. And we've had 20 years that have been the most peaceful, the most healthy of all time in history. And maybe we've lost sight of the fact that people die. So that's the one side. And then everybody else who's had it get immunity, and it kind of fades into the background. Added to that, you then get a vaccine that you can put in the system, like we get the flu vaccine every year, and that protects us. And then COVID just lives in the system, but it's like flu. And only a few get it every year, and only a few people are badly affected. So that's your best case scenario, I think, and that could happen over the next few months.
Cool. Thanks, Graeme. So with the worst case scenario, I mean, I've been hearing the World Economic Forum is consistently warning that lifting lockdowns too soon and too quickly, it could be one of the biggest dangers that we have. So I assume that the worst case scenario really would be around that. If lockdowns get lifted too early, and then what is a possible worst case scenario after that, Graeme?
Well, the big issue obviously is the mortality rate, and we're still not sure. This disease is still so new, we still don't know. Some countries like Germany and Austria, even China, have kept the actual death rate quite low. Other countries like the UK, the US, and others, it's insanely high. At some stage in Italy, it was running close to 17% compared to confirmed cases. So at the moment, it's just unclear. So the worst case scenario is that a lot more people die than we expect, millions of people, and in the process overwhelm the hospital situation, the hospitals. And that means that people who have other issues, so you have a heart attack, or you stand on a rusty nail and you just have to go and get a tetanus shot, and the hospital say, well, you can't come here. And so you literally die of diseases you shouldn't have died of, or you die of issues you shouldn't have died of, because you can't go for kidney dialysis or because you're on chemo or something. So it's not necessarily only the people that die of COVID, but it's the collapse or the overwhelming of the medical system. And we haven't yet seen in Africa what this looks like in the HIV community and in people who have previously had TB. We just, at the moment, we literally don't know, and we're scared of what it could look like. So I don't think we've come anywhere close to recognizing what the worst case scenario might look like. So apologies that we weren't planning to scare you too much with that. But I think, Zanele, this is your point, isn't it? That if you look at the best case and the worst case, the reality will be somewhere in between. And if you then do that for your business, and this is the key, you do it for your business, you look at what's the worst case scenario. It's no use giving your team false hope and saying, hey, 1st of May is coming, we're all going to go back to work on the 1st of May, you've also got to imagine, well, what happened if you can't? You know, so for example, the schools are absolutely not going back on the 4th of May. I can guarantee you that. The best case scenario for the schools is that they phase the learners back in, and they will start with the matrics. That's for those of you outside of South Africa, they'll start with any year that has an assessment process in it, because they need to get those kids ready for that assessment, whether it's the school leaving certificate or moving from one school, you know, lower school to middle school or primary school to high school. So those years will be phased in. But there might be other grades and school years that are told, no, you guys are staying at home. And as a parent, you've got to work out if your job says you have to come back to work, but your school says your child can't go back to school, you've got to plan for that. You can't wait for the morning of the day that you find that out and then think, now what do I do? You've got to begin thinking about that. And if you're an employer, you've got to realize that you can't just say to your staff, come back to work next Monday, and all your staff go, hooray, that's easy for me to do. I'm just going to get in a taxi, I'm going to send my kids to school, and I'm going to be at the office at 9 o'clock on Monday. It isn't going to happen. So this is the point of your process, right, with people. Zanele, you do those scenarios so that you can actually plan for the worst if the worst happens.
Exactly. And when I'm being a little bit cheeky, I usually ask organizations which of them actually had a global pandemic in their scenarios that they were working towards. And it's funny now, but this is the thing. And if we want to be better prepared, this is how we need to start to think. This is how we need to work around our creativity strategies and our innovation. And that's what we do with our clients. And this is something that's worked out quite well. So those are the three main things that I wanted to share. And I see Garland has also said that Romans is introduced to this voucher idea. And that's great news. I love Romans pizza. So I think I might look into that.
So Zanele, why don't you just type up for people? I know you gave them the link. So people, if you didn't check the chat box, just scroll down a little bit. Zanele did give you a link to an article that she published on LinkedIn. But Zanele, while I talk for a second, why don't you just type up those three things, just the outline, just for people again, just as a reminder for them to take away. This is what we do at Tomorrow Today. This is what our team does. We are able to set scenarios. So we're able to come and bring scenarios to your team to help your team to see what is happening. You can find some of those scenarios on our website, tomorrowtodayglobal.com, and on our YouTube channels, and those are free. So you can take those, you can share them with your team and get that conversation started. But very often, this conversation that Zanele is suggesting, these steps that you go through, it's very difficult for you to do that when you are immersed in your own industry. You are immersed and invested in all the ways you've done things before. And the very first thing, as Zanele said, is to accept the fact that there is no normal. Now, Zanele, normally we have to take a few hours of workshops with our clients to kind of just bash them over the heads a few times to say, guys, normal is not, sorry, you're a much nicer facilitator than I am. So if they want somebody a little bit that doesn't bash them around, then get Zanele. But you want, we've spent the last few years trying to convince our clients that disruption is coming. At least now, step one is fairly easy for us, at least, because everybody understands that the disruption is real. But the problem right now is that we are seeing that everybody understands the disruption of lockdown is real and are desperate to go back to normal again. And so this is exactly your point now, right, Zanele? We need to help people to see, and hopefully our simple examples today of hairdressers and schools and churches and airlines, when you think it through, you realize it's impossible for us to go back to any form of normal. And so then, Zanele, just remind us again, you've now put it in there. Step 2 was that personal inventory, which is around the learning and unlearning inventory. And the third thing is then to look at those scenarios and to realize, have we learned enough yet? Have we got enough insight so that we can respond to whatever scenario emerges?
Precisely. Yeah. And I think you spoke a little bit about this, but I just want to hammer on this point that the leadership is so important here. I think you said something and you made a joke about it, that you stand up and you say, okay, everyone, let's go back to work. But what we want at this time during a crisis is that we want our leaders to be open and honest with us. So we want to know what they know at that time, what they understand, and when and how they will know more. That's how we're able to then be fully open to then starting our creativity process and innovating, is when we understand what our situation looks like, guided by our leaders or whoever's at the helm in their own realm at that time. I think that's something that's really important. Adding on to now the scenarios, just a quick little thing before we end off, is that you want to make this something that you'll enjoy, and especially with the anxiety around this time. I want to suggest that whatever process you put in place to help you make that jump, your unlearning jump, is something that's quite fun, something that will be enjoyable, that will help you to release some really positive hormones and actually start to have a different perspective on this. And an example I have is Volkswagen did fun theory. I don't know if you remember this, Graeme, in 2009. What they did was they wanted to find out that if they make change fun, would it help people to actually make hard and difficult choices? So one of the experiments that they then conducted was between an escalator, there was an escalator and then a flight of stairs right next to it. So they turned the flight of stairs into a keyboard into a piano. So every time you stepped on it, it actually made a sound. It made some lovely piece of music as you went up the stairwell. And when people who were about to take the escalator, and this is the interesting thing, saw that someone who was walking up the stairs was actually having a really good time, they decided to then change their minds and forget the fact that I actually don't want to work out. This looks fun. And I think that this is one of the ways we can start to get ourselves to enjoy the change process. And this is something I work with my clients as well. Start to enjoy it. That way it becomes a lot easier to make the change. Because I think as much as we can say what we say, unlearning and moving from one normal to the next is quite a hard and challenging thing to do.
I'm glad you said that, because I told people to just go and hit their staff around the head. I hope they didn't hear me incorrectly. That was very metaphorical. You, Zanele, you're absolutely right. And I think this is your passion, and you're brilliant at doing this, is to make this fun for people. Yes, right now we're in the midst of massive disruption. We're in the midst of a crisis. Everybody's riddled with anxiety and stress. But you know what? In having the conversations that you need to have next, you can, in fact, do it in a fun way. Again, maybe some external facilitation will help you to do that, because it's an external voice that's not as invested in your system as you are. So don't forget that you have resources. You're able to still work in community-minded ways. You're able to still have fun in learning. None of that stuff has disappeared. We've just got to do it in a slightly different format. So are there any questions? I know there's been a lot of comments, and Zanele and I both try to sort of keep up with some of those comments. You are welcome to connect with us directly. Both Zanele and I have names that are quite easy to find when you do a Google search. So you can look for, we've both got .com websites, just our full names .com. You can also go to our company website, TomorrowTodayGlobal.com. And you can connect with us that way. But we've got a few more minutes of this webinar left. If there are any specific questions, just throw them into the chat box. We'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, what we really just wanted to do with this webinar today was three things, and I hope we've done that. The first was to just really help you to do Zanele's first step. is to completely and utterly recognize there is no normal to go back to, and you have to have these conversations. The second thing we wanted you to do is to realize you should have these conversations as soon as possible, and that you probably haven't even begun to think through all of the consequences of what's about to happen next. So if you want your staff to come back to work, how do you keep them safe? How do you transport them to and from work? What is their home situation like? Because their kids might not be able to go to school. What's the entire ecosystem? So that kind of comes to Zanele's second point of what are some of the things you have to learn and unlearn? We can't just go back to the way that things were. And then the third thing we wanted you to do was to realize that you can do this, that there are skills, there are processes, there are facilitations available that can help you and your team to think through these things. We don't have to be paralyzed by anxiety or fear or uncertainty. We can't just sit and wait for everything to sort itself out. We've got to step in here. Maybe, and there's also a fourth thing, and I can throw this back to you, there's maybe some people are ready to already think about the opportunity mindset as well. We haven't really mentioned that today. But this disruption, the creativity, the unlearning, that's your specialty, that might lead to new opportunities and ideas that will be disruptive in a positive sense and change a company or an organization forever, for good.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I love to use the example of your Uber and your Airbnb that were actually born during times of crisis. But, and here's another interesting that I want people to take home, is that your Uber and your Airbnb, or really great parts of the sharing economy, were great at the time. But if you look at the way that we're changing going forward, maybe not so much, especially during this time. And that really proves how the first point that we made is that the system and everything in it is malleable. So what worked and was actually a great idea during the last crisis that gave birth to a sharing economy that we all absolutely love is not so relevant today. So each and every situation or disruption brings about a new, going back to what I said earlier, a new profile of what our clients need at the time. And that's what we need to respond to. With that, always be open to changing that. So even that is subject to change. And I think I always speak about this, that every time we feel like we put our heads up, everything's changed, but rightly so. And we can't expect anything else. And I think, unfortunately, we have sold ourselves the story that everything is supposed to stay the same for some reason, when unfortunately that's not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just say this. That's kind of the end of what Zanele and I kind of had planned to say, and what we wanted to get across with you. No deep rocket science here, because I think a lot of the MBA theories are out the window now. What we're needing at the moment is this dose of reality, a strong commitment to unlearning and relearning, and then that possible opportunity mindset at the end. So hopefully that was useful for you. If you have to get out of here now, we're done with that. But there are some comments and questions, and both Zanele and I have got a few more minutes, and we can answer those. So Zanele, I know both you and I are churchgoers and people of faith. What do you think is going to happen with churches? I know there's a little joke to be made here, and hopefully people appreciate my slightly naughty sense of humor. There are some churches that are going to have no problem. They only ever had 5 people in them every Sunday anyway. But sorry, I wanted to see if you spit laughed a little bit there. But I think both you and I go to churches that have quite a few people, and we can't go to church in the way that we were going to. You have to physically distance in any public gathering. So churches are going to have to think this one through, right?
Yes, it really is. And one of the concerns that my priest had as we went into the lockdown was that he fears people are not going to want to come back. But I think that's another issue of going back to the purpose of the activity and whether there is actually a different way. And now this is going all the way back the culture of doing things and what it actually means to engage in any form of practice. And I think it takes us right to the root of why we do the things we do. And when we go right back to that, then we understand that the medium or how we engage in that activity can actually change. We just get so fixed in the way we think about it that we find it so difficult.
Agreed.
Graeme, do you perhaps remember?
Go for it, Zanele. You picked up something?
That mindset book that you...
Yes, by Carol Dweck, yeah, brilliant.
Okay, yes. I see Richard is also suggesting it. I was about to add it onto the chat as well. Really great book. Strongly suggest you have a read of that book, especially if you want to think like a futurist, which is something we strongly suggest that everyone learns to do. So really great book.
In fact, I've got a bookcase of books behind me. I'm just wanting to see if I can pull it. No, I don't have it. Just to show it. But yeah, in fact, anything by Carol Dweck at the moment would be good. I can't find the question now, so I can't say who said it, but somebody asked about what are the low-hanging fruit, what are some of the business opportunities available out there? And honestly, I do think that that's a great question. And there are two ways to answer that question. The one is for you as a business to look at your current customers, and instead of asking how do we give our current customers what we used to give them, we ask what do our current customers really want. And we might not be able to give them what we used to give them, but we might be able to give them some stuff that they want. So there's a simple example of that one. Near our house, we have a small family-run ice cream company. They make ice creams called Paul's. For a number of years, they used to do pop-up shops in garages and parking lots and so on. Then they opened a few shops around Rosebank and Sandton mainly. And when we went into lockdown, my daughters said, make sure we've got enough Paul's to get through. Forget alcohol and everything. Our house needed Paul's ice cream to get through a month of lockdown. And we started running out. And so we went onto Paul's website, and we kind of were we hoped that Paul's would have been able to classify as an essential service. I mean, it absolutely is. Ice cream is way cheaper than therapy. But sadly, of course not. I mean, ice cream's not an essential service. But what Paul's had done in the meantime is Paul's had said, right, our job is to make ice cream and get it to our clients. But what our clients really need at the moment is home deliveries. So they applied for an essential services permit for delivery services. And they've put together like a breakfast box, so you can get a box of Pronutro and a box of cereal and 2 liters of milk and some bread and a liter of Paul's ice cream thrown in. And then you've got a cleaning box so that you can get some hand sanitizer and some disinfectant and a box of Paul's ice cream. And so there's a whole lot of people who really want Paul's ice cream, but they also want deliveries done. And I wonder, and so Paul's do deliveries, and you can get your ice cream and a whole lot of other stuff you were wanting as well. And I really wonder what Paul's ice cream might look like after lockdown is over. They might have discovered that actually doing deliveries of other people's products is actually a very lucrative way of connecting with clients, adding a service, and they might have extended their service. So it's a small example, it's a simple example, but it's an example of saying not how do we get back to what we were doing, but how do we extend more services to our existing clients. The other thing that you can do is to literally start from scratch. And if you're an entrepreneur, you'll know what this looks like. And that is to say, what do people need now? And then start to look to see if that is something you might be interested in doing. So, for example, the gin distilleries that have converted their factories into hand sanitizer factories, because apparently it's a very similar process. I'm not going to tell people who drink gin that they basically drinking something close to hand sanitizer, but anyway, apparently that's the case. And I'm a wine person, sorry, I'll be snobbish at this stage. But, will the gin distillery think that maybe in the future, as much as gin was a cool little hobby, hand sanitizers made us a lot of money. And so entrepreneurs are continually looking for where's the gap. And actually, if you scroll back through the chat box, there were some quite interesting ideas a little bit earlier on about going, say, into the sanitization business, because every hotel room, every taxi, every public transport is going to have to be sanitized a lot more than before. And so maybe there's an outsourced service available there. So it's a mindset shift. Zanele and I could probably give you a list of 10 things and then you'd add another 20. It's that mindset shift, isn't it, Zanele, that we really need, that opens things up for people. It's not going back to the way things were. A new normal is emerging.
Yeah, rather focusing on the opportunity that's there. And I saw someone was talking about, I don't know who it was just now, but just speaking about how children are going to now grow up very nervous of being social with other human beings and this type of thing, and how the economy is going to crash and we're all going to crash and burn. But remember that this is how opportunities and new ideas actually come about. I rather prefer to use the term restructuring of the system. So it's merely changing shape. It's changing the way it looks, not necessarily that the whole thing is catapulting. And the reason why we see it like that, once again, is because we've just got this fixed idea of what it needs to be, which, as you said, Graeme, is really just about the mindset. So working through that first then starts to open up the avenue to what the opportunities could potentially be for what this new normal actually looks like. And then not expecting that other normal to somehow creep back into existence, because unfortunately it's not going to be the case.
Well, final thing to say, somebody's asked, will this webinar be available to share with others? Absolutely it will. I've put the link in there. It's tomorrowtodayglobal.com/webinars. You will also get an email later today or maybe first thing tomorrow morning that will just give you a link to the replay of this webinar. That's not a very user-friendly version, though, because you kind of have to watch the whole thing as if it's live again. We will upload it to our Vimeo website and put a link at the tomorrowtodayglobal.com webinars page, and you can go and get it there. It's totally free, totally shareable. You can share it with anybody you like. If Zanele or myself or anybody else from the Tomorrow Today team can help you, either to talk this through, to work with your team, we're all set up, as you can see, in our home studios. We're good to go. Didn't hear any cello music, didn't hear any drain pipes bursting in the background. So we made it through there. And we're able to work with you and your team if thinking through some of these things and getting an external person in to just take you step by step through some of this thinking is going to be useful. So please be in touch with us. Obviously, that's a marketing message. We also trying to do our work and make some money. But both Zanele and I are prepared. If you're not making money from your clients, we're prepared to help you for free. So, we're prepared to work with organizations that are struggling at the moment to help you. And maybe we should have a voucher system, and any people can buy our services now and pay us when they can.
They take money from our services.
Yeah. We'll do it the opposite way around. We'll give you our services for free, and then you give us a voucher, and we'll come and get the voucher later. But we're very happy to help everybody at the moment. If you can't afford us, we'll try and help you anyway. But if you can afford us, obviously this is how we make our living, and we'd love to be involved with you. Zanele, I'll leave the final words with you. Thank you so much for this hour together. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much, Graeme. And I think you've pretty much wrapped everything up. I think the only last thing that I can say is our willingness to help, and how creativity and innovation are so perfectly timed right now that if you waste this crisis, you're going to be in a position that doesn't look so great. So whatever it is you do, whoever you bring in, whatever platforms you use, whatever research you do whatever it is so that this crisis is not wasted. You don't want to let a good crisis go to waste. So if you do need any kind of help from myself and Graeme and our team, please definitely do reach out. We can't wait to hear from you. Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.